The axle cracked with a sound like a gunshot, just as the sun bled out over the Wyoming horizon. And Hannah Vaughn knew she was in trouble before the wagon lurched sideways and came to a grinding halt in the middle of nowhere. She climbed down from the driver's seat, her worn boots hitting the dusty ground as she surveyed the damage in the fading light of August 1878. The rear axle had splintered clean through, and her wagon sagged at an angle that made her stomach drop. She was 3 days out from Challis, Idaho, heading east through Wyoming territory to meet her sister in Cheyenne. And now she was stranded on a lonely stretch of prairie, with night falling fast, and her supplies running dangerously low. Hannah pushed a strand of dark hair from her face and looked around at the empty landscape. Rolling grassland stretched in every direction, broken only by scattered stands of cottonwood and the distant purple shadows of mountains. She had passed a ranch sometime that morning, but it had to be 15 miles back by now. Going forward or backward on foot in the dark would be suicide. Her only option was to stay with the wagon and hope someone came along in the morning. She unhitched her mare, a sturdy gray named Bess, and tied her to the side of the wagon where she could graze on the sparse grass. Then Hannah pulled out her bedroll and the last of her dried beef, settling in for what promised to be a long, uncomfortable night. She had a rifle, at least, and knew how to use it. Her father had made sure of that before he died 2 winters ago. The stars came out in force as true darkness fell, more stars than she had ever seen, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Hannah wrapped herself in her blanket and tried to sleep, but the sounds of the prairie night kept her alert. The rustle of wind through grass, the distant cry of a night bird, and then, as the moon rose full and bright, another sound that made her blood run cold, howling. Close. Too close. Hannah sat up and reached for her rifle, her heart hammering against her ribs. The howling came again, and this time it was answered by another voice, and another. She scrambled to her feet and moved to the other side of the wagon, peering out into the moonlit darkness. At first she saw nothing, but then movement caught her eye. Low shapes circling. Yellow eyes reflected the moonlight. Wolves. At least half a dozen of them, maybe more, forming a ring around her broken wagon. Bess whinnied in fear and pulled against her tether. Hannah raised the rifle with shaking hands, knowing she had maybe 4 shots before she would have to reload, and there were too many of them. They were coming closer now, emboldened by her fear, their lips curling back from white teeth. The leader, a huge gray male, was less than 20 yards away. She fired into the air, hoping to scare them off, but they barely flinched. One of them darted forward, testing her defenses, and she swung the rifle toward it. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could fire, 3 shots rang out in rapid succession from somewhere beyond the circle of wolves. The sound was deafening in the quiet night, and this time the wolves scattered, yelping and running for cover. Hannah spun around, searching for her unexpected savior, and saw a rider approaching at a gallop, a rifle still raised in one hand. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hat pulled low over his face. As he drew closer, Hannah could make out more details in the moonlight. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with a strong jaw shadowed by a few days of beard growth. He wore range clothes, dusty from travel, and there was a natural ease to the way he sat his horse that spoke of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. "You all right, miss?" His voice was deep and carried a hint of concern as he pulled his horse to a respectful distance from her wagon. Hannah lowered her rifle slowly, her hands still trembling from the rush of fear and adrenaline. "I am now, thanks to you. I thought I was done for." He dismounted in one fluid motion and walked toward her, his eyes scanning the darkness where the wolves had disappeared. They will likely come back if they are hungry enough. That pack has been troubling this area for weeks now. I have been tracking them. Are you a hunter? Hannah asked, studying his face now that he was closer. He had blue-green eyes that seemed to catch the moonlight, and despite the exhaustion she could see in the lines around them, there was something kind in his expression. Rancher, mostly. Name is Fletcher Garrett. My spread is about 8 miles west of here. He gestured back the way he had come, then turned his attention to her wagon. Looks like you have got some trouble there. The axle broke just before sunset. I was trying to make it to Cheyenne, but now I am stuck in the middle of nowhere with wolves circling and no way to fix this mess. Hannah heard the frustration in her own voice and took a breath to steady herself. I am Hannah Vaughn. I appreciate you coming along when you did. Fletcher walked around the wagon, examining the damage with a practiced eye. He crouched down and ran his hand along the splintered wood, then stood and shook his head. This is not something you can fix out here in the dark. You are going to need a new axle, and that means either getting this wagon to a town or having someone bring the parts out here. I do not suppose you have a spare axle at your ranch. Hannah tried to keep her tone light, but she knew she was in serious trouble. She had maybe $10 to her name, and that needed to last until she reached her sister. I might have some timber we could use to fashion something, but it would take time. Fletcher looked up at the sky, gauging the hour by the position of the stars. The wolves will be back soon, and there is no point in both of us staying out here waiting for them. You should come back to the ranch with me tonight. We can ride back out in the morning with tools and supplies to fix this properly. Hannah hesitated. She had been raised to be cautious around strangers, especially men she met alone on the prairie in the middle of the night. But she also was not stupid. Staying here with a broken wagon and a pack of hungry wolves was certain death. Going with this man was a risk, but it was a calculated one. What about my horse and my things? She asked, making her decision. Bring what you can carry. Your mare can follow behind mine. The wolves will not bother the wagon once we are gone. They are after easier prey. Fletcher was already moving, helping her gather her most important belongings into a canvas bag. He worked with efficient, economical movements, and Hannah found herself trusting him more with each passing moment. Within 10 minutes, they were ready to leave. Hannah mounted Bess while Fletcher swung back into his saddle on a big bay gelding. He took the lead, setting a steady pace through the moonlit prairie, and Hannah followed, her bag clutched against her chest. They rode in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through grass. Hannah found her thoughts drifting as exhaustion caught up with her. She had been on the road for nearly 2 weeks, sleeping rough more often than not, and the terror of the wolf attack had drained what little energy she had left. How much farther? She asked, her voice barely carrying over the sound of their horses. Another hour, maybe less. Fletcher glanced back at her, and even in the darkness she could see the concern in his expression. Can you make it? I will make it. Hannah straightened her spine, refusing to show weakness. I have come too far to give up now. Where are you coming from? Fletcher asked, and Hannah appreciated the distraction of conversation. Challies, Idaho. My father had a small ranch there, but after he died, I could not keep it going on my own. My sister married a man in Cheyenne last year, and she wrote to say there was work there, so I sold what I could and started east. Hannah paused, surprised at how easily the words came. She had not talked to anyone beyond basic pleasantries in days. What about you? Have you always ranched in Wyoming, born and raised here? My father started the ranch 30 years ago, back when this was still wild country. He died 5 years back, left the place to me and my brother." Fletcher's voice carried a hint of something Hannah could not quite identify. Sadness, maybe, or regret. "My brother moved to California 2 years ago, so now it is just me and my hired hands." "That must be lonely," Hannah said softly. "Sometimes." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, then added, "But the land has a way of keeping you company. There is always work to be done, always something that needs tending. Does not leave much time for loneliness." Hannah thought about her own loneliness, the long nights after her father died when she lay awake in the empty ranch house and wondered how she would manage. She had tried for a year, working herself to exhaustion, but in the end the ranch had defeated her. There was simply too much for one person to handle alone. "I understand," she said, and meant it. The ranch appeared gradually, materializing out of the darkness as they crested a low rise. Hannah saw lamplight first, warm yellow squares in the windows of a sprawling single-story house built of timber and stone. Beyond it, she could make out the darker shapes of barns and outbuildings, corrals and fences. It was bigger than she had expected, clearly a successful operation. 2 dogs came running as they approached, barking a greeting rather than a warning. Fletcher spoke to them in a low voice, and they calmed immediately, trotting alongside his horse as he led Hannah into the yard. A door opened and a man emerged onto the porch, lamp in hand. He was older, maybe 50, with gray threading through his dark hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent his life outdoors. "Boss, we were starting to worry," the man called out. "It is nearly midnight. Had some tracking to finish, then ran across this lady in distress. Wolves were circling her broken wagon." Fletcher dismounted and moved to help Hannah down from Bess. His hands were gentle but firm on her waist as he lifted her to the ground, and Hannah felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger or fear. "This is Hannah Vaughn," Fletcher continued, turning to the older man. "Hannah, this is Tom Brennan, my foreman. Tom, can you see to the horses? Miss Vaughn will be staying in the guest room tonight." Tom nodded, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Pleasure to meet you, miss. And do not worry, your mare will be well tended." He took the reins from both of them and led the horses toward the barn, leaving Hannah and Fletcher alone in the yard. "Come on inside," Fletcher said, gesturing toward the house. "You must be exhausted and hungry." Hannah followed him into a large main room that served as both kitchen and living area. It was clean and well kept, with sturdy furniture and a stone fireplace that still held the embers of an earlier fire. Fletcher stirred the coals back to life and added fresh wood, then moved to the kitchen area and began pulling out bread, cheese, and cold meat. "It is not fancy, but it is food," he said, setting the plate on the table along with a tin cup of water from a covered bucket. Hannah sat down and ate with more enthusiasm than manners, suddenly aware of how hungry she actually was. Fletcher watched her with an expression that might have been amusement, but he said nothing, just sat across from her and nursed his own cup of water. When she finally pushed back from the table, feeling almost human again, Hannah met his eyes and said, "Thank you for everything. I do not know what I would have done if you had not come along." "You would have figured something out," Fletcher said with certainty. "You have that look about you. Stubborn, determined." "Is that a compliment?" Hannah asked, feeling a smile tug at her lips for the first time in hours. "Where I come from, it is the highest compliment." Fletcher stood and gestured down a short hallway. "Guest room is the last door on the left. There should be clean linens on the bed. We will head back to your wagon at first light and see what we can do about that axle." Hannah rose and collected her bag, then paused at the entrance to the hallway. "Fletcher, thank you again. Truly." He tipped his hat to her, a gesture that seemed both old-fashioned and entirely natural. "Get some rest, Hannah. Tomorrow will be a long day." The guest room was small but comfortable, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the dark prairie. Hannah stripped off her dusty clothes and crawled under the blankets in her shift, and for the first time in weeks, she felt safe enough to truly sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment she was disoriented, not sure where she was, but then the events of the previous night came flooding back. She dressed quickly and made her way to the main room, where she found Fletcher standing at the stove, expertly managing several pans at once. "Morning," he said when he noticed her. "Hope you are hungry. I made extra." They ate breakfast together as the ranch came to life around them. Hannah could hear voices outside, the sounds of men beginning their day's work. Fletcher explained that he had 4 hired hands in addition to Tom, and that they ran about 300 head of cattle on land that stretched for miles in every direction. "It sounds like a lot of work for 6 men, Hannah observed. "It is, especially during roundup and branding season. But we manage." Fletcher finished his coffee and stood. "Speaking of which, we should get moving if we are going to get your wagon fixed today. I have already sent Tom and one of the other men ahead with tools and timber. We will meet them there." The ride back to the wagon took less time in daylight, and Hannah was able to see the country properly for the first time. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, all rolling grassland and endless sky. She could understand why someone would choose to make a life here, despite the hardships. They found the wagon exactly as they had left it, and Tom and a younger man were already at work assessing the damage. Hannah recognized the younger man as barely out of his teens, with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger. "This is Danny," Fletcher said by way of introduction. "Best hand with wood I have got." Danny blushed at the compliment but focused on his work, and Hannah watched in fascination as the 3 men worked together to fashion a temporary repair. They could not replace the entire axle out here, Fletcher explained, but they could reinforce it enough to get the wagon back to the ranch. And from there, they could either complete the repair or get her to the nearest town. It took most of the day, and Hannah helped where she could, handing tools and holding pieces in place while they worked. The sun climbed high and hot, and by mid-afternoon they were all sweating and dusty, but the repair was holding. "It is not pretty, but it should get you where you need to go," Fletcher said, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "Question is, where do you want to go? Back to my ranch to finish the repair properly or straight on to the next town?" Hannah considered. The sensible thing would be to move on, to get back on the road to Cheyenne and her sister. But standing there in the Wyoming sun, watching Fletcher's capable hands as he tested the wagon wheel one more time, she found she was not ready to leave yet. "Your ranch," she said. "If the offer still stands, I would rather have a proper repair than risk this breaking again in the middle of nowhere." Something that might have been relief crossed Fletcher's face. "The offer stands. Let us get this wagon moving before the sun gets much lower." They made it back to the ranch just as the sun was setting, and Hannah helped Fletcher unhitch Bess and get her settled in the barn for the night. The other men had already headed to the bunkhouse for supper, leaving them alone in the comfortable dimness of the barn. "I should pay you for all this help," Hannah said, though her heart sank at the thought of parting with her small store of money. "The repair work, the meals, letting me stay." Fletcher shook his head firmly. "I would not take your money even if you offered it at gunpoint. You help your neighbors out here, no questions asked. That is just how things are done." "Then how can I repay you?" Hannah asked, moving closer to him without quite realizing she was doing it. Fletcher looked down at her, and in the fading light his eyes were the color of a summer storm. "You could stay for supper again, and breakfast, and maybe a few more days after that while we finish the repair properly." Hannah's breath caught. There was something in his voice, something in the way he was looking at her, that made her pulse quicken. "Why would you want me to do that?" "Because," Fletcher said slowly, as if choosing his words with great care, "it has been a long time since I had someone interesting to talk to. And because I would like to get to know you better, Hannah Vaughn, if you are willing." She should say no. She should thank him politely and insist on leaving as soon as the wagon was fixed. She had a destination, a plan, a sister waiting for her in Cheyenne. But standing there in the barn with Fletcher Garrett, Hannah found herself saying, "I would like that too." The next few days fell into a rhythm that felt dangerously comfortable. Hannah woke each morning to the sounds of the ranch coming to life, dressed, and joined Fletcher for breakfast. Afterward, she would help with small tasks around the ranch while Fletcher and his men worked on her wagon and tended to their regular duties. They ate lunch together, usually something simple that Fletcher threw together with surprising skill, and in the evenings they would sit on the porch and talk as the stars came out. Hannah learned that Fletcher had been married once, briefly, when he was 22. His wife had been a town girl from Cheyenne who thought she wanted ranch life, but discovered too late that the reality did not match her romantic notions. She had left after less than a year, and Fletcher had never heard from her again. The experience had made him cautious, he admitted, reluctant to open his heart to anyone else. She told him about her father, about the ranch in Idaho that had been her whole world until it was not anymore. She told him about the loneliness of those last months, trying to keep everything going alone, and the difficult decision to finally give up and start over somewhere new. "I felt like I was failing him," Hannah confessed on the third night, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I was letting go of everything he built." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think your father would be proud of you for knowing when to change course. It takes more courage to start over than it does to keep beating your head against a wall." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back. "Thank you for saying that." He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with gentle strength. "I mean it, Hannah. You are one of the bravest people I have ever met." They sat like that for a long time, hands joined, watching the stars wheel overhead. Hannah felt something shifting inside her, some wall she had built around her heart beginning to crumble. She was falling for this man, falling hard and fast in a way that should have terrified her, but instead felt as natural as breathing. On the fourth day, Fletcher declared the wagon fully repaired and safe to travel. Hannah inspected the work and could find no fault with it. The new axle was solid and properly fitted, the wheels were sound, and all her belongings were still safely stowed in the back. "You did beautiful work," she said, running her hand along the smooth wood. "This is better than it was before it broke." That was the idea. Fletcher stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body in the cool morning air. "So I guess this means you will be leaving now." It was not a question, but Hannah heard the hope underneath it, the unspoken plea for her to stay. She turned to face him, her heart pounding, and saw her own emotions reflected in his eyes. He wanted her to stay, and God help her, she wanted to stay too. "Fletcher," she said carefully, "I need to be honest with you about something." His expression turned wary. "What is it?" "My sister in Cheyenne. She does not actually know I am coming. I wrote to her months ago but never heard back. I do not even know if she is still there, or if there is really work available, or anything. I have just been moving forward on faith and hope because I did not know what else to do." Fletcher absorbed this information, and slowly his wariness transformed into something else. Relief, maybe, or possibility. "So there is nothing waiting for you in Cheyenne. No job, no place to stay. Nothing certain." Hannah felt vulnerable admitting this, but also oddly free. "I've been making this journey on little more than a prayer." Fletcher took both her hands now, turning her to face him fully. "Then stay here. Stay with me. This ranch needs a woman's touch, and I need you, Hannah. These past few days have been the happiest I have had in years. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other less than a week, but I feel like I have been waiting for you my whole life." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. "Fletcher, I cannot just stay here without it being proper. People will talk. Then marry me." The words came out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back, and they finally burst free. "I know it is crazy. I know we barely know each other, but I am 30 years old and I have learned to trust my instincts. And everything in me is saying that you are the one I have been waiting for." Hannah stared at him, her mind reeling. Marriage. He was proposing marriage. A week ago she had been alone and struggling and heading toward an uncertain future. Now she was standing in a Wyoming ranch yard with a good man offering her everything she had ever wanted but been too afraid to dream of. "Say something," Fletcher said, and she could hear the nervousness beneath his steady tone. "Even if it is no, just say something." "Yes," Hannah said, and then louder, "Yes. Yes, I will marry you." The smile that broke across Fletcher's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He swept her into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. Tom and the other ranch hands came around the corner just in time to witness this, and Tom let out a whoop of joy. "Well, it is about time, boss. We were starting to wonder if you were ever going to work up the nerve to ask her." Fletcher pulled back from Hannah, his arm still around her waist, and called out, "She said yes. We are getting married." The men broke into cheers and congratulations, and Hannah found herself blushing under the attention. But she was also smiling so hard her face hurt, because she was happy. Genuinely, completely happy for the first time in longer than she could remember. They decided to get married in town the following week, giving Hannah time to make a proper dress and Fletcher time to arrange his affairs. She wrote to her sister in Cheyenne, explaining the change in plans and inviting her to the wedding if she could make it. She also wrote to a few old friends in Challies, sharing her news and her new address. The week passed in a blur of activity and preparation. Hannah threw herself into making the ranch house more of a home, cleaning and organizing and adding small touches that made the space feel warmer and more welcoming. Fletcher watched her work with obvious appreciation, and often she would look up to find him staring at her with an expression of wonder, as if he could not quite believe she was real. They talked more in that week than Hannah had talked to anyone in years. They shared their hopes and dreams, their fears and disappointments. Fletcher admitted that he had almost given up on the idea of marriage and family, that he had resigned himself to a life alone on the ranch. Hannah confessed that she had been afraid she would end up a lonely spinster, dependent on her sister's charity, and that finding him felt like a miracle. "Not a miracle," Fletcher said, pulling her close as they sat together on the porch one evening. "Just fate. You were always meant to end up here, Hannah. That wagon breaking when it did in that exact spot right when I was tracking those wolves. That was not coincidence. That was destiny." Hannah rested her head against his shoulder and smiled. "I like the sound of that. Destiny." They were married on a bright Saturday morning in late August in the small church in the nearest town, a settlement called Bridger that was about 30 miles from the ranch. Hannah wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton that she had sewn herself, and Fletcher wore his best suit, looking handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal clothes. Tom served as Fletcher's best man, and the preacher's wife stood up for Hannah. Her sister had not made it in time, but Hannah found she did not mind. This was her new beginning, her new life, and it felt right to start it with just Fletcher and their small circle of friends. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Fletcher kissed her with a tenderness that made Hannah's heart overflow. This was real. This was her future, and it was more beautiful than anything she had imagined. They rode back to the ranch as the sun climbed high, and Hannah noticed that Fletcher had directed the wagon toward a spot she had not seen before, a rise that overlooked a small valley with a creek running through it. "I wanted to show you something," Fletcher said, helping her down from the wagon. He led her to the edge of the rise and gestured at the valley below. "This is the prettiest part of the ranch and the most protected. I have been thinking we could build a new house here, something bigger, built just for us. The current house was my father's and it has always felt like his, not mine. But this could be ours, Hannah, if you want it." Hannah looked out at the valley, imagining a house nestled there, with windows that looked out on the creek and the cottonwood trees. She imagined children playing in that yard, imagined growing old with Fletcher in a home they built together from the ground up. "I want it," she said, turning to smile at him. "I want all of it, the house, the life, everything, with you." Fletcher pulled her into his arms and held her close, and Hannah felt the last piece of her broken heart slot back into place. She had traveled so far, lost so much, but in the end she had found exactly what she needed. Not just a home, but a partner. Not just safety, but love. They spent their wedding night in the ranch house that would soon belong only to memory. And Fletcher was gentle and patient, and everything Hannah could have hoped for. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, he traced patterns on her shoulder and whispered, "I love you, Hannah Garrett. I will love you until the day I die." "I love you too," Hannah whispered back, and knew with absolute certainty that it was true. The months that followed were the happiest of Hannah's life. Fletcher kept his word and began construction on the new house in the valley, working on it whenever ranch duties allowed. Hannah helped with the design, sketching out rooms and choosing where windows should go. She wanted a large kitchen with windows facing east to catch the morning light, and a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings. Fletcher wanted a proper parlor for entertaining, and a bedroom big enough for a large bed, and all the children they hoped to have. By October the frame was up, and by Christmas the house was weatherproofed and ready for finishing work. They moved in on New Year's Day, 1879, carrying their belongings through snow that fell in fat, lazy flakes. It felt like a blessing, like the world welcoming them to their new beginning. Hannah had worried that she might feel isolated on the ranch, cut off from other women and the social life she had known in Challies. But she discovered that the ranching community was tight-knit and supportive. Other ranch wives visited regularly, sharing recipes and gossip and advice. Hannah made friends, real friends, and felt herself becoming part of something larger than just her and Fletcher. In the spring, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Fletcher one evening as they sat on their new porch watching the sunset, and the joy on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. "A baby," he breathed, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Hannah asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. Happy does not begin to cover it. Fletcher pulled her close, his voice thick with emotion. "You have given me everything, Hannah. A home, a future, and now a child. I am the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy was not easy. Hannah suffered from terrible morning sickness in the first months and exhaustion that left her barely able to stand by evening. But Fletcher was endlessly patient and supportive, taking over household tasks without complaint and making sure she rested as much as possible. By summer she was feeling better, and her belly had swelled with obvious pregnancy. Fletcher fussed over her constantly, insisting she not lift anything heavy or work too hard. Hannah found his concern both touching and occasionally frustrating, but she loved him for it. Their son was born on a cold November night, arriving 3 weeks early after a long and difficult labor. Hannah had never known such pain, but the moment the midwife placed the squalling infant in her arms, every moment of suffering was forgotten. "He is perfect," Fletcher breathed, staring down at his son with tears streaming down his face. "Hannah, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Jacob Fletcher Garrett, Jacob after Hannah's father. He had Fletcher's blue-green eyes and a shock of dark hair, and from the moment he entered the world, he had both his parents wrapped completely around his tiny finger. Life settled into a new rhythm after Jacob's birth. Hannah's days were consumed with caring for the baby, while Fletcher managed the ranch with the help of his hired men. They were exhausted and overwhelmed and happier than either of them had ever been. Jacob grew quickly, hitting every milestone with enthusiastic determination. He was walking by 10 months and talking by 15 months, a bright, curious child who wanted to know about everything he saw. Fletcher doted on him shamelessly, taking him out to see the cattle and horses as soon as he was old enough to sit in front of his father on a saddle. When Jacob was 2, Hannah discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and their daughter Sarah was born on a beautiful spring day in 1882. She had Hannah's dark hair and a temperament that was calmer and more contemplative than her boisterous older brother. The house that had seemed so spacious when it was just the two of them now rang with the sounds of children laughing and playing. Hannah often found herself pausing in her work to simply stand and listen, marveling at the life she and Fletcher had built together. The ranch prospered under Fletcher's management. He was a fair employer and a smart businessman, and word spread that the Garrett Ranch was a good place to work. He never had trouble finding reliable hands, and the herd grew steadily year after year. Hannah established a large garden behind the house, growing vegetables and herbs that kept them supplied year-round. She learned to can and preserve food, to make cheese and butter, to turn the raw ingredients of ranch life into meals that kept her growing family healthy and satisfied. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep, she and Fletcher would sit together on the porch just as they had in those early days of their courtship. Sometimes they talked, sharing the small details of their days. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands joined, watching the stars. "You ever think about that night?" Fletcher asked one evening when Jacob was 4 and Sarah was 2. "The night the wolves were circling your wagon," Hannah smiled into the darkness. "All the time. It was the scariest moment of my life, but also the beginning of everything good that came after." "I almost did not ride out that night," Fletcher admitted. "I was exhausted from a long day, and Tom told me to wait until morning to check those wolf traps, but something pulled me out there. Something told me I needed to go." "Destiny," Hannah said, echoing his words from years before. "We were always meant to find each other." Fletcher raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I would ride through 1,000 wolf packs to find you again, Hannah Garrett. You are my whole world." She turned to him then, seeing in his face the same love and devotion she felt in her own heart. They had built something rare and precious here, something worth fighting for, worth protecting. A home, a family, a love that would last a lifetime. When Jacob was 6 and Sarah was 4, Hannah gave birth to their third child, a daughter they named Grace. She was a tiny thing, barely 6 pounds, but fierce and determined from her first breath. Fletcher fell in love with her instantly, declaring that she had her mother's stubborn spirit and her father's good sense. The children grew and thrived, learning ranch life from the ground up. Jacob showed an early aptitude for working with horses and spent hours in the barn with his father. Sarah was quieter but no less capable, with a gift for numbers that Fletcher put to use helping with ranch accounts. Grace, the baby, was wild and fearless, climbing everything in sight and giving her mother constant heart attacks. Hannah's sister finally came to visit when Grace was a year old, bringing her own husband and 3 children. The visit was warm and affectionate, with no hint of jealousy or resentment over Hannah's changed plans all those years ago. They parted with promises to visit more often, and Hannah felt another piece of her past settle comfortably into her present. The years rolled by, marked by the changing seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. There were hard times as well as good. A drought in 1886 that nearly broke them. A winter in 1888 so brutal that they lost a quarter of their herd. But through it all, Hannah and Fletcher faced everything together, drawing strength from each other and their growing family. Jacob married at 22, bringing home a smart, capable young woman named Emma who fit seamlessly into ranch life. They built a house on the far end of the property and started their own family, giving Hannah and Fletcher their first grandchild, a boy named Fletcher Jacob, in 1897. Sarah surprised everyone by going to Teachers College in Cheyenne, returning 3 years later with a degree and a passion for education. She started a small school in Bridger, teaching ranch children who would otherwise have had no access to formal education. She married a doctor when she was 26, and they made their home in town, close enough to visit regularly but far enough to have their own lives. Grace was the one who stayed, marrying one of the ranch hands and settling into the original ranch house that Fletcher and Hannah had left all those years ago. She took over much of the daily management of the ranch as Fletcher grew older, showing the same skill and dedication her father had always demonstrated. Fletcher and Hannah grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but their love never diminishing. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Fletcher took Hannah back to the spot where he had first fired those 3 shots to scare off the wolves, where her broken wagon had been waiting in the darkness. "You remember?" he asked, his arm around her waist as they looked out over the prairie that had become so familiar to them both. "Every detail," Hannah said. "I was so scared. I thought I was going to die out here alone and forgotten, and then you came." "We saved each other that night," Fletcher said quietly. "I was dying too, in my own way. Dying of loneliness and giving up on ever finding someone to share this life with. And then there you were, this brave, stubborn woman who refused to quit even when everything seemed hopeless." Hannah turned in his arms and looked up at him, seeing past the gray hair and the weathered lines to the man underneath. The man she had fallen in love with in the space of a few days and continued to love more deeply with each passing year. "I would do it all again," she said. "Every hard moment, every struggle, every fear. I would do it all again if it meant ending up here with you." Fletcher kissed her then, soft and sweet, the kiss of a man who knew he was loved and cherished beyond measure. When they pulled apart, both of them had tears in their eyes. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun set over the prairie, holding each other close. The wolves were long gone, the danger past, but the love that had been born in that moment of fear and rescue had only grown stronger with time. As twilight gathered and the first stars began to appear, they walked back to the house together, hand in hand. Their children and grandchildren were waiting for them, the house lit up with lamps and filled with laughter and the sounds of family. Hannah paused at the threshold and looked back one last time at the prairie, at the vast open spaces that had once seemed so frightening and now felt like home. She thought about the girl she had been, alone and afraid with a broken wagon and wolves circling in the darkness. She thought about the woman she had become, strong and loved and surrounded by the family she and Fletcher had built together, Life had not been easy. There had been losses and heartbreaks along with the joys. But standing there on the porch of the house they had built together, looking out at the land they had made their own, Hannah knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single moment of it. "Coming," Fletcher called from inside, and Hannah turned with a smile. "Coming," she said, and stepped inside to join her family, closing the door gently behind her on the prairie night. The years continued to pass with the gentle inevitability of seasons changing. Fletcher and Hannah watched their grandchildren grow and begin to have children of their own. The ranch prospered under Grace's management, and Jacob's spread grew to rival his father's in size and success. Sarah's school became a permanent institution in Bridger, eventually growing to include a proper schoolhouse funded by the surrounding ranching community. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were nearly 40 people crowded into and around the house, spanning 4 generations. Hannah moved through the crowd with Fletcher at her side, marveling at how one moment of fate had led to all of this. One broken wagon, one pack of wolves, one man brave enough to fire 3 shots into the darkness. "What are you thinking?" Fletcher asked, his voice a little rougher now at 70, but still warm with love. "I am thinking about how much one moment can change everything," Hannah said. "How the worst night of my life became the beginning of my best life." Fletcher squeezed her hand, his grip still strong despite his years. "We have been blessed, Hannah, more than we ever deserved." "We have earned it," Hannah corrected gently. "Every bit of happiness, every moment of joy. We have earned it through love and hard work and never giving up on each other." As the sun set on their anniversary celebration, Hannah stood on the porch with Fletcher beside her, surrounded by the evidence of their love. Their children, happy and successful in their own lives. Their grandchildren, bright and full of promise. Their great-grandchildren, the newest generation, just beginning their own stories. "Thank you," Fletcher said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. Hannah looked up at him, surprised. "For what?" "For saying yes. For taking a chance on a lonely rancher you had just met. For building this life with me. For every morning I woke up next to you, and every evening we watched the sunset together. For all of it, Hannah. Thank you for all of it." Hannah felt tears spill down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Thank you for riding out that night. Thank you for those 3 shots that saved my life. Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me and wanting to build a life together. Thank you for 40 years of love." They stood together as the stars came out, the same stars that had witnessed their beginning all those years ago. The prairie stretched out around them, wild and beautiful and home. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, but it was far away and unthreatening, just another voice in the chorus of the night. Hannah leaned into Fletcher's embrace and closed her eyes, filled with a peace and contentment so complete, it was almost overwhelming. She had been lost once, broken and alone in the darkness with danger circling. But she had been found. She had been saved. And in saving her, Fletcher had been saved too. They had built a legacy together, something that would outlast them both. Their children would tell their grandchildren the story of how Hannah and Fletcher met. And those grandchildren would tell their own children. And the story would live on long after they were gone. The story of the wolves circling the broken wagon, the cowboy who fired 3 shots, and the love that bloomed from fear and danger into something beautiful and lasting. As the celebration continued inside, as their family laughed and talked and made memories of their own, Hannah and Fletcher stood together under the Wyoming stars, 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and built a life worth living. It was not the end of their story, but rather a perfect moment within it, a chance to pause and appreciate everything they had created. And as they finally turned to go inside, to rejoin their family and continue the celebration, Hannah knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. This was home. This was love. This was the life she had been meant to live all along. The broken wagon had brought her here. The wolves had driven her into Fletcher's arms. But it was love, pure and simple and enduring, that had kept them together through 4 decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. And that love would continue, passed down through generations, a living testament to what 2 people could build when they chose to face the world together. As the door closed behind them and they rejoined their family, Hannah took one last look back at the prairie night, at the stars and the darkness and the wild beauty of it all. She smiled, squeezed Fletcher's hand, and stepped forward into the warmth and light of home, grateful for every moment, every choice, every twist of fate that had brought her to this perfect, precious life. And somewhere out on the prairie, under those same bright stars, the wind whispered through the grass where a wagon had once stood broken, where wolves had circled, where 3 shots had rung out and changed 2 lives forever. The moment was long past, but its echoes remained, woven into the land itself, a story of danger and rescue and love that would never truly end.